would be very interesting and enlightening. For further information about these and other upcoming events at Charter Oak, please visit our website at charteroakcenter.org. A lot of people are feeling a great deal of anxiety in the past few years about the state of our country, the state of the world. I've been advising people to spend time being with, listening to, or reading about visionary, brave people who, with courage, conviction, and creativity, have ideas about new ways of doing things, offering glimpses of a better world. Riane Eisler is one of those people. She is someone whose thought, bold and refreshing and just and inclusive, can give us all courage and hope. Dr. Riane Eisler is recipient of the Distinguished Peace Leadership Award, earlier given to the Dalai Lama, and internationally known for her groundbreaking contributions as a systems scientist, futurist, historian. She is author of The Chalice and the Blade, which is now in 57 US printings and 30 foreign editions. She's also the author of The Real Wealth of Nations, hailed by Nobel Peace Laureate Desmond Tutu as a template for the better world we have been so urgently seeking. And another book, Nurturing Our Humanity, which she co-authored in 2019 with Douglas P. Fry. Dr. Eisler's writing and her pioneering work offer new perspectives on constructing less violent and more egalitarian, gender-balanced, and sustainable future societies. Dr. Eisler is president of the Center for Partnership Systems, editor-in-chief of the Interdisciplinary Journal of Partnership Studies, and distinguished professor at Meridian? Is that, am I saying? Meridian, oh, Meridian, right, Meridian University, which offers PhD and master's, I'm not nervous at all, and master's degrees based on Dr. Eisler's partnership, domination, social scale. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Riane Eisler.
Thank you.
So here's how the evening's going to go. We're going to talk, Dr. Eisler and I are going to talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open up for your questions, which we're going to invite you to write in the chat. Dr. Eisler, I just want to say one more thing. I'm really pinching myself. It's a dream come true to be able to talk with you. You are a hero of mine, and your book, The Chalice and the Blade, rocked my world. I really couldn't put it down, and I know that many of our viewers feel exactly the same way. I read your book when it first came out in 1987, and it has continued to inspire me all these years later. So thank you for the honor of being with us tonight. I was telling Dr. Eisler before you all came on that really Charter Oak is an outgrowth. The way we do things at Charter Oak is an outgrowth of Dr. Eisler's work. I read it 35 years ago, but it still continues to inspire me. And really, Charter Oak really is about building partnerships in terms of how the staff functions together and our work in the world. And so I'm very, very personally grateful to you for your leadership. So I have a few questions. Would you like to say something, Ben?
Well, I just want to say thank you, and that it is a pleasure to be with you today. And I love what you're doing, Donna, and what your congregation is doing, what your arts projects are, just about everything. As I said to you before we started, you're really doing partnership work in every sense of the word, not just working together, but empowering people, being caring, everything. So thank you. And it is, of course, a pleasure to be with all of you. And I look forward to talking with Donna and then talking with members of the group.
That's great. You know, I never told you this, but the way this whole thing came about was I was talking with a young man about renting our space. And he, out of the blue, he said to me, I just read this was a few weeks ago. You know, this was maybe the beginning of December. He said, I just read the most amazing book. I have no idea why he even said that to me. And I said, really, what book is it? And he said, The Chalice and the Blade. And I said, oh my goodness, that is one of my favorite all-time books. It changed my life. And he said to me, I think that it's coming up on a special anniversary. And so we looked it up and said, oh my God, it's the 35th anniversary. And then I looked you up and found your email address. And I have to say, you embody the work that you've done. You are gracious and generous and have been throughout all of our conversations about tonight. So I want to thank you for that too. So would you tell us a little bit about your childhood and how your childhood experiences in Vienna impacted the work you went on to do?
Certainly. I think that those of you, who was this young man? I'd like to know who he was, by the way, Donna, but you can tell me later. And I love the fact that so many men, as well as women, because the Chalice, of course, is about looking at the world, our past, our present, and the possibilities for our future through a holistic lens that no longer excludes the female half of humanity. So I love it when men really, I mean, I've gotten so many letters saying at last in the partnership model of society, there's a place for me as a man. Now, my childhood, I have a lot of passion for this work, as those of you who have read my works know. And that passion is actually deeply rooted, as you mentioned, Donna, in my own childhood traumas, really, my own childhood experiences as a refugee child with my parents from Nazi Europe. And I cannot begin to tell you about how much that influenced me. Crystal night, when a gang of Gestapo men broke into our home, dragged my father off. But yes, I mean, I witnessed cruelty and insensitivity and violence, but that night I also witnessed something else that profoundly affected me. And it's what I have come to call spiritual courage. And my mother displayed this courage. We're taught to think of courage as, courage to slay the dragon, kill the enemy, right? But spiritual courage is the courage to stand up against injustice out of love. And my mother displayed this courage. She recognized one of the men who came as a young man who had been an errand boy for the family business. And she got furious. How dare you do this to this man who has been so kind to you? And she could have been killed because many Jewish people were killed on Crystal Night, so called because of all the glass that was shattered in Jewish homes and businesses and synagogues. But by a miracle, she wasn't. Of course, eventually some money passed hands and she was able to obtain my father's release, and we were able to flee. And we obtained an entry permit to one of the very few places in the world that still in 1939 would let Jewish refugees in, Cuba. And I grew up, of course, in the industrial slums of Havana, where I experienced and witnessed another injustice, the enormous gaps between have and have-nots of Cuba at that time. And all these experiences, questions arose in my child's mind, questions that I'm sure many of you have asked. Why, when we humans have such an enormous capacity for consciousness, for caring, for creativity, why has there been so much insensitivity, cruelty, and violence? Is it, as we're so often told, selfish genes, original sin? Is it just innate human nature, or are there alternatives? And if so, what are they? And that is what animated my research. Many years later, of course, my multidisciplinary, cross-cultural, transhistorical research, drawing from a holistic database that no longer, unlike right, left, religious, secular, Eastern, Western, Northern, Southern, includes in the categories of societies, the whole of humanity, including the majority, women and children. And that makes a huge difference. And I call these, well, it's really a scale, the partnership, domination, social scale.
Do you think that your Judaism played any role in your thinking?
I think it did. Well, obviously, I mean, it was being born Jewish that brought about these experiences that led me to these questions, but it was more than that. After the war, I saw how there is this Jewish ethos of helpfulness, of caring. And I'll get back to that. I mean, that's one of the themes in the real wealth of nations, the need for what I've called a caring economics of partnerism that transcends both capitalism and socialism, but we can talk about that later. But my parents, as the only ones who really got out, because most of my extended family was killed, and the few survivors in the camps, they needed help. And so, yes, being Jewish did influence me in that sense very much. On the other hand, and I think, Donna, you as a rabbi in a congregation that is more progressive will relate to this. I remember how shocked I was when we used to pray in Hebrew, which was a good thing in some ways, because I didn't understand the words. But when I understood this prayer that said, "Thank you, God, for not making me a woman," it was like, hello, I'm a woman. In other words, there are domination elements mixed in with the partnership elements in the Hebrew scriptures, as well as in the scriptures of all of the world religions. And I want to stop for a moment to say that in one of my books, in The Power of Partnership, which I think you would love, Donna, and maybe would want.
I'm reading it. I'm reading it right now.
You're reading, well, then you can see that it would lend itself to a course, really, to a series, because it's so, first steps, going further, etc. It's very pedagogically oriented towards both personal and social change.
Yes.
But in it, I point out that we really need, and I wrote an article about this for Cosmos recently, I think last year, we need to bring spiritual leaders together to use the partnership domination social scale, the configurations of the partnership and domination system, to sort out our scriptures, strengthen the partnership elements as you are doing, and identify, not eliminate, but identify the ones that arose in the course of the shift from partnership to domination.
Can you say something about the scale?
Yes. Well, when I chose the term partnership, which, as you know, Chalice came out in '87, and I worked for a long time on my books. I have been working on that for 10 years, and there was no word really. I mean, I coined the word gailani, as you know, gyne and andros, linked with the L, gailani. But so I chose the term partnership to describe the alternative to a domination system. And unfortunately, then that term became totally co-opted. When I chose it because in a business, I have a legal background too. I went to the UCLA Law School. In a business, at least in theory, the relations are supposed to be based on mutual responsibility, mutual accountability, mutual benefit. And then it became co-opted, of course, to mean working together. That's it. So I want to say that as a preface, because we are so often told oh, if we only work together. Well, people work together in the domination system too. Cartels work together, gangs work together, terrorists work together, but it's a very different kind of working together. It's in-group versus out-group. So very quickly, let me explain what I mean by these two. And I can explain it perhaps by giving two examples. One is in nurturing our humanity particularly, but also in the Chalice and the Blade. I describe what we are finding out today from archaeology, from anthropology, from linguistics, even DNA studies, which is that for millennia, for thousands of years, our species oriented more to the partnership than domination side. For example, this is an example from prehistory. There's a site, the largest Neolithic, that is means early farming site ever excavated, is called Çatalhöyük in Turkey. And you can see there in the size of houses, for example, in the grave goods, that it was really not a top-down society, which is what the domination system is, that it was more egalitarian. You also find, as the archaeologist Ian Hodder wrote in an article for the Scientific American, with some surprise, it was gender balanced. And this is one of the differences between this analysis and conventional ones. Once you take gender into account, you begin to see that it is not coincidental, again, talking of the partnership domination scale, that some of the most repressive and violent modern regimes, whether it was Hitler's Nazi Germany, Stalin's former Soviet Union, right, left, Khomeini's Iran, religious, secular, the Taliban, Trump, they all really have as a top priority something that we've got to pay attention to, which is either maintaining or imposing a family system that is rigidly male dominated, authoritarian, and highly punitive. So gender is how a society organizes. Well, how are children taught about difference, right? Are they taught to value it? Not in domination systems. They are taught that the most fundamental difference in our species between the female and male forms, and everybody in between, of course, but between these two forms, it's so associated with either superiority or inferiority, dominating or being dominated, being served or serving. And that is a template for all in-group versus out-group thinking and acting, whether it is Shia versus Sunni or Sunni versus Shia in the Middle East, right? Or whether it's racism in the United States. No matter, whatever the authority figures say, is the person to blame, not the system, but the person, the out group to blame. That's who we fight. So gender is a very important difference, how gender is organized. Violence and abuse. Domination systems are maintained by, I wrote a book called Sacred Pleasure, which is really one of my favorite books that I wrote. The subtitle, I don't know if you've read it, Donna, have you?
Yes, a long time ago, yes.
Yes, the subtitle is Sex, Myth, and the Politics of the Body. And it applies the templates, the configurations, to both sexuality and spirituality throughout time and cross-culturally. Anyway, domination systems are really held together by fear of pain, right? I mean, whether it's in the family, and yes, these models take into account to not marginalize the family. I mean, if you read your conventional sociology analysis, there's hardly anything about family. And if it is, it's somewhere out here, right? Rather than showing the connection between what children experience and observe, which we know from neuroscience is fundamental. I mean, this is why I wrote Nurturing Our Humanity, which, by the way, came out a couple of years ago with Oxford University Press. And I highly recommend it. But the point of it is that there is some violence. People sometimes lose it, some abuse in partnership systems, but it isn't normalized. It isn't idealized. And of course, story and language. The stories, so many of the stories that we've been told, including the stories about our cultural origins, you know, this idea that we're inherently as a species mean, bad, right? So we need to be rigidly controlled from the top, right? I mean, that's a really a normative story, and it happens to be untrue. So the partnership model, of course, I had to coin new words. I coined the terms a hierarchy of domination and hierarchy of actualization. Why? Because every society needs parents, needs managers, needs teachers, needs leaders. But how is power conceptualized and exercised? And of course, the chalice and the blade are two symbols of power, aren't they? The blade, power in the domination system, you know, the power to control, to dominate, to take life. The chalice is very powerful too, but it's the power to give life, to nurture life, and to illuminate life. So we have a whole new way, really, through this research of looking at the world. And as Donna said, I'm very happy that Meridian University is now offering a program for partnership practitioners, a master's or PhD. And if you're interested, please go to centerforpartnership.org and you'll find it. That was a long answer, but it's not so simple to explain this.
No, it was a wonderful answer. I have a whole set of questions, but I want to depart for one moment and say, as I'm listening to you, as we're listening to you, you have a very peaceful energy. Do you feel hope?
You know, people often ask me if I'm optimistic or pessimistic. Of course, I feel hope. As for optimism or pessimism, you know, I know enough from looking at the long arc of history that so much around us, including our cultures, not just all of the material, you know, the chair I'm sitting on, the desks, the technology, are human creations. We can recreate them using the partnership system as rather than the domination system as our guide. And as a matter of fact, I have grounded hope, not only because of neuroscience. Neuroscience, for example, shows that contrary to the conventional story about evil human nature, actually the so-called pleasure centers of our brains light up more when we care and share than when we dominate and win. But the brains, I mean, we know today how much it isn't a question of genes, but of gene expression. And this is what we have to understand. And gene expression happens in interaction with our environments, which are largely our cultural environments. So I think it's a whole new world view, a view that recognizes that our past, you know, was more partnership oriented, but also that recognizes that so many of the events not only in the last 3 decades, but the last 300 years, and intermittently throughout recorded history, have been the resurgence of partnership. And we are in the midst now of, I mean, the struggle for our future is not between right and left. I mean, look at Kim Jong-un's North Korea, for goodness sakes, when you're talking about left. I mean, or, I mean, these, you know, a colleague of mine calls our old categories weapons of mass distraction, because they fragment our consciousness. We have to think holistically, and then we can see the connection, as I said, between what children first experience and observe, childhood, gender, and yes, of story, you know, the stories that we are told, and politics and economics. It's a whole way of understanding the world better, and then being more effective in intervening, in accelerating this shift from domination to partnership. And we wouldn't be having this conversation if we hadn't, to some extent, in our Western society, shifted from domination to partnership. I mean, think of the European Middle Ages. They looked a lot like the Taliban, didn't they? The Inquisition, the Crusades, the witch burnings, human rights. I mean, forget it. So yes, I have hope. And I have hope because, as I said, and I hope we'll return to this, we are seeing many partnership trends, countered by enormous resistance and punctuated by periodic regressions. And we're in the midst of really the struggle, not just for the soul of democracy, but for the survival and flourishing of our species.
And yet you feel hope that the partnership will prevail?
Look, I think that we humans have a tremendous urge to survive. And we are at the place where climate change, I mean, at our level of technology, not only technologies to exploit and really harm our natural life support systems, but weapons like nuclear bombs, biological warfare, our survival is at stake. Technology, contemporary high technology guided by an ethos of domination, is about to do us in. So there is no way that we can survive without making the shift. Excuse me just a moment, I can't, I'm doing a webinar, bye-bye. Give him David's hearing aid. Didn't Glenda tell you? It's in the kitchen in the black box. Forgive me, I'm sorry, it's one of my husband's caregivers and his hearing aid is out. And somebody is taking it in for us.
Do you think that social media can be anything but a vehicle for the domination model?
Oh, definitely. I mean, but it requires us to, number one, use it to do that, requires human agency. And yes, it requires changing the business model and therefore the economic reward system. That's why I wrote a whole book. It's a real Wealth of Nations. You know, it's a play on Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations, because we have inherited a lot of domination elements in both capitalism and socialism, even though both of these modern theories of economics actually challenged some elements of domination. I mean, Smith challenged mercantilism, you know, the rule, economic rule from the top by kings and royalty, etc. And then, of course, along came Marx, and he challenged the bourgeoisie, the whole model that Smith introduced. And really, we would not tell our children that everything would be fine if only everyone were selfish. And that is a crazy interpretation of Smith. Yes, he did say that self-interest, but self-interest can also, as we know, recognize our interconnection with other human beings and other life forms, for goodness sakes. So I'm deviating here, but I think that what your question is a very important one today. I mean, we're talking about virtual reality. I mean, my gosh, and guided, I mean, the amount of violence that children are exposed to, that adults are, it's the adrenaline rush. We've got to challenge creative people to really wean our population from its addiction to the traditional epic, which glorifies precisely what keeps domination systems going.
What would an economy look like? What would the United States economy look like if we adopted a purely partnership model?
Well, we see trends in that direction. I mean, in the Real Wealth of Nations, the subtitle is Creating a Caring Economics. President Biden is talking about caring economics. It got co-opted again to just mean direct care. But what a caring economics, oh, and he also picked up another term. I mean, you know, terms get into the language. For example, human infrastructure. It's a new term, isn't it? But I coined that term, and we haven't paid attention to it. And we must, if only because we're moving into the post-industrial knowledge service era. And we know that the most important structure, capital, if you will, I hate that, you know, objectifying people, but, you know, economists keep talking about high quality human capital, right? Being the most important capital for the post-industrial era. Well, for one thing, we know that whether we do or don't have these creative, flexible people who know really how to solve problems rather than just obeying or giving orders, that largely hinges on the quality of care and education, especially the quality of care and education children receive in their first 5 years. And Biden and other more progressive legislators are beginning to recognize that. But it's, if you ask me, what would a caring economics look like? It would be guided not by amassing more and more stuff, which studies show that the people who have a lot of stuff are not quite happy, are they?
Right.
I mean, it's a void, because what people really need more than anything else is caring connection. And the domination system gets in the way of that in a myriad of ways. So a caring economics would be guided by an ethos of caring, rewarding the so-called women's work, yes, of caring for people starting at birth and caring for our natural life support systems. I mean, let me back up a little, because if you look at both capitalism and socialism, there is nothing in either theory about our caring for our natural life support systems. For both Smith and Marx, nature is there to be exploited. And as for caring for people, that for them was not productive, but reproductive work to be done for free by a woman in a male-controlled household. And it helps having a multidisciplinary background, by the way, because I know, for example, about laws that even as late as when Marx wrote. In many places, a wife, a woman, because most women did marry, could not sue herself for injuries negligently inflicted on her. Only her husband could for loss of her services.
Right.
Okay, so that is what got inherited by us. That is what guides GDP. We at the Center for Partnership Systems have, by the way, are developing a social wealth index, which shows the economic value of caring for people starting at birth and caring for our natural life support systems. But a GDP does not include the three life-sustaining sectors, neither does capitalism or socialism. In the real wealth of nations, the economic model is a complete, just like the analysis is complete and includes the whole of humanity, so the economic analysis does not ignore or marginalize the natural economy, the volunteer community economy, or the household economy. And there is, of course, a relationship between keeping a clean and healthy home environment, right, and devaluing that, and keeping a clean and healthy planetary environment. You have to start connecting the dots, and you can't with our current social analysis and our social categories. So it's time, as Einstein said, for new thinking, because we cannot solve problems with the same thinking that created them.
Right. Have you consulted with President Biden?
No, I haven't. But his major economic advisor, Jared Bernstein, gave a tremendous comment about the real wealth of nations, as you will see when you get the book.
Huh. Wow. You know, one more question. I think I could listen to you all night. I don't want to let you go, but I do want to make room for everybody else's questions. But I just wanted to mention that there is a book, it's very hard to get a hold of now, called The Dawn of Everything. Yes. And basically it's like 700 pages. And it's about, it's trying to make the argument that the kind of system we have now is not inevitable, that throughout history, there have been other kinds of models. The authors, I think, are suggesting that it's like an anarchist, they would call it an anarchist model. And as I mentioned to you, when I read about the book, because I have not been able to get a hold of it, I thought, oh my God, 35 years ago, you were saying that. And I don't think they do a gender analysis. I haven't read the book, but I haven't read anything about any kind of gender analysis. But recently, their book was reviewed in the New York Review of Books. And they mentioned you, and I was like, finally. Is that, if you had to, you know, while standing on one foot, kind of summarize the chalice and the blade, is that one of the things that you hope that people would walk away with, this message that the system we have now is not inevitable, that there are other possibilities?
But I think that the chalice and the blade does more by a long shot than the beginning of everything, which wanders all over the place. And I think all of these books are important because they're challenging the conventional canon, the conventional narrative. And by the way, when in terms of gender analysis, he does, the authors of that book do recognize that Çatalhöyük was gender balanced.
Oh.
One place where they mention it, instead of looking for patterns. See, I think pattern recognition is so essential, and it's something we need to teach children. Because if we don't see the pattern, we can't intervene. And it is by recognizing the patterns. I mean, let me give you an example. If you look at modern history, modern Western history in particular, through the lens of the partnership domination social scale, you see that every single progressive social movement in the last 300 years has challenged the same thing, a tradition of domination. the so-called Enlightenment Rights of Man movement challenged the so-called divinely ordained right of kings to rule their, quote, subjects. The feminist movement challenged, again, the so-called divinely ordained right of men to rule the women and children in the, quote, castles, you know, a military image of their homes. The abolitionist civil rights, the Black Lives Matter movement challenged another so-called divinely ordained domination tradition of a, quote, superior race to rule over, quote, inferior ones, all the way to the environmental movement challenging our once hallowed conquest and domination of nature, which, as I said, at our level of technological development is about to do us in, not of a population, you know, is part of that too. So but if you really look carefully at these movements, you see something else. You see that most of them have focused on challenging the so-called, well, what I call the tip, you know, the top of the domination pyramid, politics and economics as conventionally defined. And they have left in place 4 foundations. And it is on those foundations, if you really analyze regressions, you know, whether it was Trump in the United States, which really started with Reagan, but I mean, hit a crescendo with Trump. Whether, you know, it's Nazi Germany, as I said, or Soviet Union, they have not paid enough attention to childhood, and we must, to gender. And obviously we have a hidden system of gendered values governing economics. There's always enough money, isn't there, for, well, for prisons, right? And who's that? That's the dominator stereotype of the punitive male head of household. Or for weapons and wars, who's that? That's the dominator icon of the hero as warrior, as killer. But somehow there isn't enough money for social policy, for caring for people, for childcare, for health care. I mean, it's reality. You know, Chalice has 2 chapters on reality stood on its head, remember? It's reality. We have to stand reality right side up. And of course, so the first cornerstone is childhood. Second one is gender. The third is an economic system that gets rid of that hidden system of gendered values and values what is really valuable to us. And fourth, yes, story and language. Linguistic psychologists have long told us that the categories provided by a culture's language channel our thinking. So it's almost impossible to even imagine something else. And that is why I really invite all of our participants to become informed, immerse yourself in this, and yes, spread the change in consciousness. Change, I don't have to tell you, starts with changes in consciousness.
You know, and we're going to open it up to questions, but I just want to say I was very struck in the power of partnership in what you said about, you know, that you said there are 7 relationships that are going to change our lives. And the first one is the relationship with ourselves. And I love that you said that we should apply the partnership model to ourselves. And because it sounds kind of dualistic, you know, as if there's some kind of a split inside ourselves. But what you meant by it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that whenever we have those kind of voices in our head that are, you know, those negative tapes, people call them, that actually is channeling the domination model. And that when we are in partnership with ourselves and loving towards ourselves and compassionate towards ourselves, then we are employing the partnership model. And once we can do that inside ourselves, then we can go out into the world. So it's like kind of Russian nesting dolls. Did I get that right?
Yes, and it's really all interconnected. You know, The Power of Partnership was awarded the distinction of being the best self-help book of the year it was published. And it is very different from most self-help books, as you said, because yes, it starts with how we relate with ourselves and our intimate relations, our work relations, but then it goes on to
Yes.
our community, our national relations, our international relations, our relations with nature, our spiritual relations, they're all very different depending on the degree to which they orient to the domination or partnership side of the social scale. So that's why I really recommend that book, uh, because it is so practical. And
Yeah.
I think it's very suitable to courses in communities like you have.
Yeah, we would absolutely consider doing it. One of the things I really like about the book is very often you'll hear people say, well, you got to change yourself before you can change the world. But you really provide a map in that book for how those things are connected. And I think that's really marvelous. And I also think, I know that when I hear one of those negative tapes, if I think of it as the domination model kind of intruding, that's going to really motivate me to not listen to it. So on that note, we're going to open up to questions. I have one more question for you, and that is, can I come home with you?
I guess I'm looking at the chat and I love this question. Ponder, how lovely to have you here. I know Ponder and she's amazing. And
Oh.
I'm going to read it because I know it's going to be good. One of my favorite sections in Chalice is the whole discussion of the Oresteia and the co-option of Athena as a goddess in service of male domination and an apologist for matricide. Wondering if Riane could share any thoughts about how she would imagine or represent Athena in her own natural aspect. How would she be rewritten? And I think that Ponder Goddard really puts her finger on it. We need to rewrite a lot of the old stories, a lot of the old myths. So I love that. Well, of course, to have the goddess of wisdom and the goddess of war all in one person is lunatic. I mean, there's nothing wise about killing in order to solve problems, right? So I think how would we imagine or represent Athena in her own natural aspect? We'd get rid of her being goddess of war. And if she is, again, becomes the goddess only of wisdom, then the question is, how do we define wisdom? And I think that, as I said, we know from neuroscience really that we are actually more wired for partnership rather than domination relations, but the domination systems really screw us up. The beginning and the end.
That's the quote we're going to walk away with. Domination systems really screw us up. Well said. Barbara, do you want to read a couple of questions?
Sure. Thomas Tamaka asked, prior to European conquest, holistic partnership orientation, social organization was practiced by numerous indigenous societies in the northeastern woodlands of North America, including the Iroquois Confederacy. Are you seeing much interest in your work from members of modern indigenous populations?
No, and not to mind, see, I don't know, because part of this is that I suddenly get an email from somebody or read a story by someone, who obviously has found this conceptual framework extremely useful. But to my knowledge, there hasn't been enough interest. And I think an analysis based on the partnership domination social scale would be very useful. Because not all indigenous societies are partnership societies, but many of them have retained the understanding of our connection and dependence upon our natural life support systems. And many of them are more gender balanced, or were more gender balanced. So it's a question of where are we now? Oh, and Jude Asper, another person I know, just came. My goodness, I recognize some of the people. And hello, Jude. I'm also looking at another question about trauma. And I really, really urge you to read Nurturing Our Humanity, because as you mentioned, well, the question is, would so love to see you address trauma, and if possible, the science of adverse childhood experiences and the cost childhood trauma has in pain and suffering and preventable healthcare experiences. Parent 742 billion a year in the US alone, according to the World Health Organization. And how would that change as we shift to a caring society? There is new science, the science of positive childhood experiences, that shows the value of positive experiences preventing adult mental health issues. Would so love to see you incorporate this into your talks and writing and join the movement to prevent and heal childhood trauma. And I have done so, as you will see, and have really done so in Nurturing Our Humanity, which, by the way, incorporates the findings from the ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. I mean, even in these United States, as you mentioned, the cost of childhood trauma, but you see, the problem is this. The domination system, to maintain itself, requires a domination family. Where do children learn, as I said, this gender, to equate difference with superiority or inferiority, this in-group versus out-group thinking? Where do children learn that the use of violence to impose your will on others is acceptable, normal, even moral? It's in the domination family. And they take it then into other life experiences. And of course, it causes trauma. I mean, I was teaching a course online at the University of Alabama, and I was horrified that one of the graduate students explained to me, quote, explained to me, that whipping children is a standard practice in her circle, and that it is not violence. And it was like, talk about cognitive dissonance here. I mean, I said to her, well, I mean, you go to jail for hitting an adult, and you're talking about hitting a dependent, smaller person who relies on you for survival. No wonder people get so screwed up. No wonder they learn to deflect their rage and their pain and their fear to outgroups. It's a very interesting. So what I'm trying to say is that, yes, I certainly advocate, and we have, by the way, a wonderful resource for partnership parenting. It's the Caring and Connected Parenting Guide in both English and Spanish. You can download it for free on our website, which is centerforpartnership.org. But even beyond that, we have to, I mean, the nations that have moved most closely to the partnership from the domination side pioneered laws that Northern European nations like Norway, Sweden, Finland, pioneered laws. They're not perfect, for goodness sakes, and we cannot expect perfection. We can only expect movement at this point. And perhaps we can never expect perfection of ourselves or of others, but they pioneered laws that say that it is against the law to have physical discipline against children. That is a very important partnership trend, and one we can all advocate for these laws. I mean, so yes, to answer your question, I have dealt with that. I talk about it all the time, Carrie, and I do address, and I've given speeches about trauma and how domination systems are trauma factories beginning in families, but going all the way through gender, through economics, through the whole culture.
Thank you,
Barbara?
Riane. Oh,
Oh, you have another one?
oh, there's a lot of questions, but I was just trying to cover the ones that were sent in earliest. We had, are you familiar with Thomas Edsall's opinion piece in the Times this week about the gender gap and how it is affecting politics in the United States? And if you could comment on that.
Yes, and Donna alerted me to it. And I think it's fascinating how they ignore the obvious. Yes, women are socialized more for caring than men. You know, I mean, how are men socialized in domination systems? They're socialized to not be like a woman, right? That's real masculinity. So women can't be assertive. If they are, they're ball breakers, but men can be aggressive, and that's great. And men can't be sensitive, only women can, but it's devalued, you know. So it is really, in what struck me about the article is that it just is so into the old social biology. And there are so many questions now. As I said, it is a question of gene expression. And the old story that all that matters is how many genes we pass on is an old story. I mean, that's all it is. And but even beyond that, I think what's really happening is that more women are feeling free to express their feelings, because a lot of women voted for Mr. Trump, you know. And when you really look at it, these women are really stuck in men are sissies if they're caring, right? And in fact, one study, which is in Nurturing Our Humanity, is that one thing that Trump voters had in common, which we really need to recognize, is that is a horror of assertive women, a horror of so-called uppity women, right? Of women who express their full humanity and defy the old gender stereotypes. So I think that as more women are able to raise their voices, they are no longer so brainwashed, frankly, into the domination system. But it is a complicated story, but it certainly makes you think that it's all a matter of how many genes are passed on, and that's, I think, nonsense.
We have another question that was sent to me directly for you. It's from John. He says, I recall reading among the organizations and groups reading and discussing CHALICE included Alcoholics Anonymous. That seems a remarkable experience to work through addiction and self-destructive behavior. Could you share some of the outcomes of AA groups from this? What have you known to be the most innovative use of this book?
My goodness, John, I would love to know where you read that AA groups are using it. See, because I just happen to come upon things, or people just happen to email me or appear. We have a Facebook page, and we have a Twitter page, by the way, that I invite all of you to. So I don't know, but I agree with you. It would be really very useful to understand that addiction basically is one mechanism to deal with the traumas of domination systems.
Wow.
And what have I known to be the most innovative use of this book? My gosh, let me think. I really don't know. I'll have to think about that, John. But I'd love to have inputs from all of you as to what you think is the most innovative use. I mean, Donna, for example, what she's doing is very innovative uses, as she said, you know, influenced by the Chalice and the Blade. All I know is that I get lots and lots of email, and when I used to give keynotes in person, which I haven't for a couple of years since the COVID started, a lot of people coming up to me, women and men, saying that it's really transformed their lives, their professional behavior, their personal behavior, etc., etc. I mean, there are legislators who are particularly find the social wealth economic indicators, the new metrics idea, very useful, who really find the whole economic analysis very useful. I don't know. I'm gonna leave it to all of you to decide and to let me know what you think is the most innovative use of this book or of any of my books.
We have another question asking if there is a role for laws to usher in more partnership-based society. If so, what do these laws look like?
Oh my goodness, is there ever a role for laws? Yes. And Shele Scholl, I'm looking at your comment. I look at the Brown versus the Board of Education. Obviously, it didn't change a lot of racist attitudes. You have to go deeper. You have to go to the four cornerstones: childhood, gender, economics, story, and language. But it made it against the law to segregate. I mean, it was very simple. So what do these laws look like? I think the trend, for example, I started to talk to you about societies, Northern European societies that have moved more to the partnership side. And these societies, Sweden, Finland, Norway, were so poor at the beginning of the 20th century. There were famines, whole US states, Minnesota, were populated by people fleeing the famines. Today, they invariably are in the highest ranks of the World Economic Forum's global competitiveness reports, and they are also in the highest ranks of the international happiness reports. And what really distinguishes them is not that they're socialist. They have very healthy market economies, healthy businesses, precisely because they invested in caring policies, including laws. So they certainly have universal health care, which is a law. They have very generous paid parental leave for both mothers and fathers. In fact, they started with just mothers, and then they included men, and they found men weren't taking it. So they just changed it, and they said, well, if in a family where there is a husband and a wife, if the husband doesn't take it or the other partner doesn't take it, nobody gets it. And lo and behold, more men took family leave. They invested very heavily in qualified government subsidized laws, again, child care, early childhood education. I mean, it's a question of not of do we have the money, but of priorities, And obviously, in a caring economics of partnerism, these are priorities. And I can give you many examples. I mean, for example, Governor Newsom in California recently said that he would no longer give contracts for prisons to be run privately.
Wow.
Well, prisons, like healthcare, really shouldn't be determined by how much money you make off them. It should be more caring. And we know that the recidivism rate is so much lower in these nations that have oriented more to the partnership side. And by the way, in all of these nations, gender, women are half of the, or approximately half of the national legislature. But it isn't that more women will vote for caring policies. And this is something very important. We have to connect the dots. As the status of women rises, men no longer find it such a threat to their, quote, masculinity, their status, if you will, to also embrace caring policies. Yes, to be more like a woman. So they too voted for these policies. And so once you have this frame of the partnership domination social scale, a lot of things that don't make sense begin to fall into place.
I think we have, thank you so much for that. I think we have a time for one more question, Barbara?
Yep, and the question is, where would you suggest that someone might start in reading your work beyond Chalice and the Blade?
Beyond Chalice and the Blade, well, I would suggest jumping. It depends on where your passion is. If, as one of you wrote, it is in changing caregiving of children, then go straight to nurturing our humanity. However, all my books are interconnected. That's the interesting thing. I would suggest perhaps the next book actually be The Real Wealth of Nations. Or if you're in education, I wrote a book called Tomorrow's Children on education, suggesting a completely different curriculum that not only is gender balanced, that not only is certainly, I mean, environmentally sensitive, but that is more interesting, frankly, and that really follows the human story through evolution. So you might, and I like Jacqueline's comment, I just saw it. White domination over people of color seems also to be prime motivator for a dominator past society. But you see that in-group versus out-group thinking in our nation is, whites versus blacks. But think about it for a minute. In the Middle East, it's Shia versus Sunni, or vice versa, Sunni versus Shia. It's blaming the other. And yes, not coincidentally, a lot of people who are racist in the United States adhere very rigidly to old domination gender relations. That the guy gives the orders, the woman obeys. So, and women can be very much part of the system too. So, but getting back to where you might start, I don't even know. I mean, what do you think, Donna? What do you think would be a good book to be the next one?
I'm really captivated by the power of partnership, because I think with that as an umbrella, then Wealth of Nations and Nurturing Our Humanity, I think, would be the next after. What do you think? Power of partnership?
I think that's a good idea, because it is very, very practical and very hands-on.
Yes.
And it does foreshadow the real wealth of nations, and to some extent it foreshadows nurturing our humanity. But I have to say that one of my favorite books that I wrote is Sacred Pleasure.
Yeah.
And so it's really hard. And people who read Sacred Pleasure, including men who read it, I mean, some people read it to each other at bedtime, couples. It's really sort of a fascinating thing. I would like to find all of you to sort of share your thoughts and form partnership groups, because to influence legislation, yes, very important. That is a way of changing norms. If it's against the law, it's against the law. And I don't know, there's so much. I think that you follow your passion and you will find the way.
I can't thank you enough for this beautiful evening with you, and to sit at your feet and learn has been such an honor. I want to thank the Connecticut Women's Hall of Fame for their partnership. I want to thank all of you for coming tonight, and I want to thank Dr. Eisler for continuing to give us hope and inspiring us to take action to create a more just and equitable and inclusive world. Isabel Allende said of the chalice and the